It began with a sound so ordinary you ignored it. A cough. Not the dry rasp of recycled air, not the sharp bark of battlefield lungs, but something wet and lingering, the kind that rattled in the chest like trapped water. In the hive, everyone coughed. The air itself demanded it. Thick with particulates from the forges, sour with fumes from the vats, heavy with the smoke of machines that never slept. The breath of the city was poison made routine. Water carried its own burden, tasting of rust, of chemical treatment, of pipes older than memory. Even the food was touched by corruption. Protein paste with a faint tang of oil, ration bars that cracked between the teeth with the flavor of dust. Transit corridors pressed bodies together, shoulder to shoulder, skin against skin, sweat against sweat. 1,000 ailments rode those crowds, whispered from one mouth to another, passed hand to hand, cough to cough. Yet life continued, for there was no alternative. In such a place, a cough was nothing, less than nothing. A background noise like the clank of machines or the rattle of servitors. But this cough was different. It stayed. It waited. My name was Hess, an orderly in the lower wards of Tertius Magna, level 700. Deep enough that the recycled air carried both the sting of metal and the stench of despair, yet not so deep that all hope had vanished. I had grown used to sickness. Rad burns, chemical scars, bodies bent from labor, lungs choked with dust. Each case filed, each treatment delivered, each life shortened, yet extended just enough to keep the factories running. Pain was expected. Illness was routine. The Emperor demanded duty, and duty required bodies, no matter how broken. My clinic was small. Walls of riveted metal, always sweating condensation. The air was sharp with antiseptic that never quite masked the underlying human rot. Beds lined both sides, stripped bare between patients, but never truly clean. Lumen strips hummed and flickered, buzzing like flies. The glow was steady but too harsh, bleaching every face the same shade of ash. I moved through that place like a cog in a machine. Patient in, treatment out. Prayers whispered, names written, forms signed. Day after day, the cycle turned. We patched up when the machines chewed too deep, applied salves when the chemicals ate the flesh, and we whispered blessings over mutations we dared not name aloud. I believed I understood pain. I believed I had seen the worst the Hive could offer. Then she came. A girl, young, no more than 20 standard years. Her skin was pale from endless night shifts in the protein vats, her eyes ringed with sleepless shadow. She said the cough had worsened, that it scraped her throat like something alive. She sat on the edge of the bed, hands folded, chest rising with shallow breaths. When I asked her to open her mouth, I expected nothing unusual. Yet what I saw should not have been there. Her gums carried a faint green tint, almost invisible unless you looked close. A film coated her teeth. Saliva pooled at the corners of her lips, too thick, shining with an oily sheen. The light from the lumen strip caught it wrong. Refracted as if the liquid itself held colors the eye was not meant to see. I leaned closer, and her breath met me. Sweet, cloying, not the sour tang of decay, but the perfume of flowers left too long in stagnant water. My stomach lurched, even as I forced myself to keep my face calm. Patients did not come for fear. They came for certainty. I told her it was nothing. Infection. Common, predictable, survivable. I prescribed the standard course, antibiotic tablets, and a whispered litany to the Emperor. Wrote her name in the ledger, recorded the dosage, signed the form. Routine. Mechanical. Just another patient in a city of millions. She thanked me softly and walked out, her footsteps echoing down the corridor. The door shut, but the sweetness lingered. I scrubbed my hands, though I had touched worse. I repeated to myself what every medic in the Hive repeated. These things pass. They always pass. But as I stood in the glow of the buzzing strips, listening to the endless chorus of coughing from the wards beyond, I knew this one would not. But some sicknesses do not fade. They wait, patient. Her laughter should have been a sign of healing, but it was something else. 3 days after her first visit, the girl returned, her condition far worse than before, though her eyes seemed lit by a fever that made them shine with unnatural light. The cough had deepened, heavy and wet, each breath dragging across her chest like chains pulled over stone. But it was the lesions that drew my attention. They dotted her arms, small at first, no bigger than coin slots, but each one seemed alive, pulsing with its own rhythm, as though tiny hearts had rooted beneath her skin. The flesh around them was waxy, stretched taut, glistening under the lumen strips. And when I pressed one gently for examination, a clear fluid seeped out, not pus, not blood, but something thinner, slicker, carrying a scent that turned my stomach, a mixture of rot and sweetness that clung to the air and would not leave. I scrubbed my gloves, and still the phantom odor lingered, burning my throat and watering my eyes. This was not infection as I knew it. Not gangrene, not rad-burn sores, not the chemical boils I had treated 100 times. This was different. This was wrong. I ordered a transfer to the upper levels where better gear and cleaner rooms might explain what I could not. The forms were signed, the stretcher brought, the crew moving with the tired precision of habit. We strapped her down, tightened the belts, checked the seals, and then she began to laugh. At first it was low, the bitter chuckle you hear in the Hive when misery grows too sharp to scream. Yet it swelled and rounded, laughter bubbling from her chest with every ragged cough until the sound rolled down the corridor like a hymn. Her body shook, not with pain but with joy, lips cracking into a smile that showed the greenish tint of her gums. "It doesn't hurt anymore," she gasped between the bursts. "I feel peaceful." Those words struck me harder than any smell or sight. Peace did not belong in the Underhive. Peace was foreign, a rumor traded by people who had never lived beneath the smoke. The transport crew stared at one another through fogged lenses. They had seen men die screaming, seen workers crushed in hungry machines, seen children cough blood into their hands. But they had never carried someone who welcomed suffering like a blessing. Procedure held. The trolley rattled, boots thudded, doors sighed open and shut. Her laughter followed them, echoing from the metal skin of the ward until it faded into the greater hum of the Hive. The fans, the pumps, the prayers. 3 hours later, the comm line hissed. The transport had failed to arrive. They found her in an alley 2 blocks from our door, propped against a rusted wall as if resting between shifts. Officially, she was dead. Skin pale, chest still, lesions crusted to dull wax. But when they lifted her, her eyes opened and she smiled. No twitch, no gasp, just that smile. Wet-lipped, wide, calm. The crew panicked. They sealed her in a containment shroud, invoked the Emperor's name, and burned her on the spot. Ash scattered across the alley, chased by the exhaust of the transport like gray snow in a poisoned wind. The report that followed was clean, clinical, cold. Cause of death: exposure, complication, contamination. Recommendation: incineration, closure, forget. The file was locked and stamped with a code that meant no one would read it twice. No one wanted to speak of laughter that outlived breath. No one wanted to admit that something had smiled back at them from the boundary between life and death. But I remembered. I could not forget. I had stood beside her bed. I had seen the sheen of oil in her saliva and the way the lumen light bent inside it. I had pressed the edge of a lesion and felt the warm, eager pulse pushing back against my gloved finger. I had smelled the rot-sweet perfume that made my mouth water even as my stomach turned. I had heard her say the word peaceful in a voice that should have been hoarse with pain. I washed my hands until the skin went raw and still could not wash away the knowledge. Because it was not only the memory that clung, something else had too. In the quiet after the report, with the ward lights humming and the servitors ticking through their rounds, I coughed, a small, wet sound that tasted faintly of metal and flowers. It was nothing, I told myself. A habit, a reflex, a scrap of air gone wrong. I returned to the ledger and pretended to work. The others moved on. They always moved on. The clinic cleansed the bed, replaced the sheets, filed the form, closed the case. Only I carried the remainder. I had touched her skin, breathed her air, listened to her laughter rise like prayer from a body that should have been breaking. They could burn the flesh, seal the shroud, and bury the line in a locked report. But the truth had already crossed the threshold. The seed was planted, patient as rot, gentle as sleep, and I knew where it had settled. It had settled in me. In sleep, the hive dissolved into gardens where corpses bore fruit. By then, the cough had rooted deep inside me, no longer a passing irritation, but a constant presence that rattled in my chest and lingered in my throat like a parasite nesting beneath the skin. At first, it came only at night, easy to hide in the chorus of other coughs that echoed endlessly through the ward. But soon it grew stronger, breaking into my days, forcing me to pause between tasks, leaving a wet taste of iron and sweetness with each spasm. Professional pride demanded that I treat myself, and so I turned to the clinic's machines in secret, drawing my own blood, measuring my own vitals, filling out my own charts. The results defied reason. My white blood cell count was not collapsing as infection should have demanded. It was climbing, vigorous, brimming with energy. My cardiovascular readings were exceptional, cleaner than any I had recorded in years of routine checks. Blood pressure perfect, immune markers strong, oxygen saturation ideal. By every measurable metric, I was not sick, but thriving. A man in better health than ever before. And yet the cough continued, deepening, growing thick. The sputum I spit into trays, no longer the pale froth of irritation, but viscous strands that glistened under lumen light like threads of translucent silk. When I leaned close to study it, the scent rose, a sweetness that turned the stomach, cloying and heavy. The same scent I had smelled on the girl before she died, the perfume of flowers drowning in stagnant water. Numbers told me I was healed, but my senses told me otherwise. My body lied with confidence, but my flesh whispered its own truth. Then the dreams began. At first they came as fragments, half-remembered shadows behind my eyes, but soon they overtook my nights. Complete worlds that felt more real than the waking hive. I walked in gardens that no map had ever drawn, where the ground was soft with decomposed flesh, spongy beneath my feet, seeping with pus and blood that trickled upward instead of down. Trees rose from that soil, their trunks swollen, their bark cracked and weeping thick golden ichor. Their branches bent low with fruits that pulsed as if alive, swollen sacs that throbbed with veins, translucent enough to show the shadows of organs shifting within. When they split open, they released a nectar that smelled of blood and honey, dripping into the soil, feeding the cycle again. I breathed spores that floated like golden dust in shafts of light, inhaled them deep, expecting poison, but instead felt clarity surge through my lungs, as if I were breathing truly clean air for the first time in my life. The Hive had never offered such a thing. Only this place, this impossible garden, gave lungs release. Around me, voices stirred. They did not come from mouths, but from leaves, from the whispers of fungal blooms swaying on unseen currents, from the soil itself exhaling secrets. They spoke in tongues no man had taught me, yet I understood every syllable. They told me that suffering had meaning, that rot was only a stage of growth, that death itself was not an end, but a renewal. Each word felt familiar, as though I had always known them, but forgotten until now. I touched the bark of a tree, and it wept beneath my hand, thick tears sliding down, warm and alive. And when they touched my skin, the warmth spread through me like comfort, not pain. Tendrils slithered from the soil, curling around my ankles, caressing rather than binding, pulling me deeper into the endless expanse. And always at the center was the presence. I could not name it, but I felt it. Vast beyond comprehension, yet intimate as a whisper in the ear. It gazed on me with eyes like wounds that never closed. And where others might see horror, I felt only love. A love patient, indulgent, infinite, accepting every flaw and every weakness as part of the whole. No priest of the emperor had ever given such love. No oath of service had ever held such gentleness. In those moments, I felt truly seen. Each time I woke, my body tingled, nerves alive as if touched by hands that still lingered. My sheets were drenched with sweat, my throat raw from the coughing. Yet I rose renewed, sharper, more alive. For brief minutes after waking, the gray despair of the underhive fell away, replaced by warmth, by color, by the memory of green. But then the clinic walls pressed in again, metal sweating condensation, lumen strips buzzing like flies, and the cough returned, dragging me back into the Hive's prison. Still the dreams grew stronger, more insistent, more detailed, until the line between sleep and waking blurred. Each night I traveled further, saw more, groves of trees bearing fruits that moaned as they ripened, fields where the ground shifted with bodies merging into soil, rivers of thick fluid where spores rose in clouds, and through it all the whispers telling me that I was not sick, that I was changing. I began to long for sleep, to crave the moment my eyes closed and the garden reclaimed me. And each morning I returned weaker in body, stronger in something else, something that had no name but felt inevitable. The isolation ward was meant for silence, but tonight it sang. I was making my final rounds, the clinic settling into its restless stillness, the groans of patients tapering into shallow sleep when I heard it. A contralto voice rising soft and steady from behind the sealed doors. No hymns were allowed here, no chanting, no comfort except for the dull hum of life support machines and the stuttered breaths of the dying. Yet this sound carried a resonance that turned the bolted panels into cathedral stone. The song rolled low and lifted higher, harmonies so strange they tightened my chest. Old notes without scripture, vibrating the frame of the ward. Compelled, I moved toward it, boots whispering on cold metal, breath misting inside my mask as if the air itself had grown thick with sound. Bed 7, that was the source. Jeremiah Court, factory man, a vat handler, had been ravaged by industrial acid weeks ago. Skin eaten, muscle gone, bone showing in pale arcs. We changed dressings, rationed sedatives, whispered perfunctory prayers, and waited for the end. Duty, procedure, nothing more to be done. Yet when I palmed the seal and pushed the door, I found not the slow quiet of a failing life, but a chamber alive with impossible music. He sat upright when he should not have sat at all. The wounds that had gaped across him no longer looked like wounds, but gardens in miniature. Fungal blooms had rooted along the edges of ruin. Translucent stalks swayed gently with the tide of his breath. From their tips spilled a soft green phosphorescence, washing the room in a calm that made the lumen strips feel cruel. Across his chest, where acid had carved ravines, clustered colonies pulsed in delicate time with his heartbeat, a field of lamps turning on and off in living rhythm. It was terrible. It was beautiful. His eyes were white with cataracts that seemed to ripple like living film. Yet his gaze found me, with perfect certainty, and did not let go. And the song, Emperor Witness, the song did not end when his lips closed. It rose from the blooms themselves, from the weeping borders of scars, from the damp air above his skin. Harmonies braided and unbraided, tones nested like spores inside seed pods, a music not made by instrument or lung, but by decay, learning how to sing. "You hear it too, don't you?" he asked. And the consonants trembled with undertones that were not human, resonances vibrating through the growths along his ribs and throat. I meant to deny him, to recite the catechism of health and purity, to name it fever speech, terminal delirium, a function of failing nerves. But the truth stood there with me. I could hear it with my ears, with my bones, with the ache behind my teeth. The ward answered in kind, vents breathing in solemn rhythm, pumps working their measured pulses, lumen coils humming in sympathetic drone. The melody wrapped them all together until machine and man and mold were one choir, one breath. It was older than any scripture I had ever murmured, the rhythm of life feeding on death and death feeding life in return. It was the garden in sound. The air smelled sweet and earthy, the perfume of growth where rot would have ended things. I should have gagged behind my mask. Instead, I drew deeper, greedy as a starving man scraping the tin of his ration. "The song has always been here," Jeremiah said, smiling. And with his smile, the soft green light brightened as if the colonies understood. We were too healthy to listen, too eager to fight what we are. There is no pain now. There is only the work, the cycle, the comfort of being part of it. Words like that should have been indictments, proof of corruption the Ministorum warns against. Yet they fitted into me like a key turned in an old lock. I had told patients that pain was the enemy. The music said pain was a language. I had treated wounds as faults. The harmonies said wounds were doors. And the presence I had felt in sleep, the vast, patient watcher with eyes like open sores, stood here too, unseen but intimate, a hand over my shoulder, a breath warm at my ear. "Jeremiah," I said, my voice small within the choir. "What if this is a trick? The ruin we are warned about?" He tilted his head, and the blooms along his jaws swayed like listeners around a storyteller. "Ruin?" he whispered. "Listen." The music lifted closer, not louder, closer, until the distance between note and nerve disappeared. Patterns revealed themselves. Call and answer, growth and cutback, hunger and relief. Ritual older than mold, older than rust, older than prayer. My training tried to surface, indexes of symptoms, charts of septic shock, protocols for isolation and disposal. But doctrine felt thin here, paper armor in rain. The reality of the sound was heavier than fear. I stood and listened until my knees ached and the mask rasped at my lips, and still I did not step back. The patient who should have been a husk sang a cathedral out of broken flesh. The ward that should have been a tomb had found a voice. At last, the song eased, like tide slackening. Jeremiah sagged against the pillows, spent but calm. The colonies dimmed to ember glow. I checked vitals with hands that trembled. Pulse slow but steady, breathing shallow but sure, temperature high but not climbing. By every measure, he was long past saving. By every sense, he was being remade. I sealed the door and stepped into the corridor, but the music did not stay behind. Once heard, it lived in the body. It threaded the hum of transformers, hid in the hiss of recirculators, rode the steady tick of servitors counting their rounds. I felt it in the bones of the hive. As if miles of ducting and pipe were just the chambers of a vast throat learning to sing along. I tried to summon the Emperor's maxims, to wrap myself in their iron lines. Chaos corrupts, corruption damns, the only cure is fire. Yet the words rang tinny against the memory of that living harmony. What if the fire I trusted was only a cleaner silence? What if silence was the error? What if life was louder than doctrine would allow? I stood in the dim and let the echo settle. When I closed my eyes, I saw the green light again, not as mockery, but as benediction. And I understood a boundary had shifted. I had entered the isolation ward to confirm the approach of death. I left having heard a language I could not deny. Whether disease or grace, heresy or communion, the song had entered me as surely as any spore. I could not unhear the song, nor unsee its beauty. How can decay feel more honest than health? The question gnawed at me as the cough deepened, as my nails began to change. First, a faint tint at the edges, then full discoloration, fading from dull gray to a greenish hue that caught the lumen light like tarnished copper. I clipped them back, filed them, burned the shavings as medical waste. Yet each new layer that grew was stranger than the last, streaked with veins that pulsed faintly beneath the keratin. When I spat into trays, the sputum no longer looked like phlegm, but like tissue blooming into shape. Filaments spreading, branching, cells unfurling under the microscope into delicate patterns, like petals opening to light. I should have recoiled. I should have cataloged it as pathology, logged it as contamination, sealed the samples for destruction. But when I leaned closer, when I adjusted the focus, I saw symmetry too precise to dismiss, beauty too deliberate to name accidental. These were not cells gone wrong. They were cells fulfilling some hidden purpose, shaping themselves into fractal designs that echoed the whispers I still heard at night. Each slide became a window into the garden that haunted my dreams. Spores clustered like constellations. Threads wove into tapestries of green and gold. I found myself staring for hours, forgetting to record, simply watching the slow unfurling of life inside the glass. It was rot, yes, but it was also creation. Patients noticed the change in me before I admitted it to myself. My hands, they said, felt different, warmer, alive in a way that startled them. Where once my touch had been cold, clinical, a tool of examination, now it carried weight, comfort, even calm. "You steady me," one man whispered as I changed his dressings. Another, fevered and raving, quieted when my palm pressed to his brow. Even the children, usually restless and afraid of any contact, clutched my fingers as if they held not medicine, but solace. I told myself it was routine, placebo, coincidence. But the truth was obvious. Something in me had changed, and through that change, the suffering around me began to alter. Wounds no longer seemed only wounds. They became mouths, speaking languages of pain. Fevers sang in rhythms, each spike a beat in a greater song. Cries of agony became syllables I could almost translate. And when I listened closely enough, I found patterns hidden in the noise. It was not meaningless torment. It was communication. One evening, after a long shift of tending burns and coughing lungs, I realized I no longer dreaded the ward. I felt drawn to it. Every patient was a verse in a hymn, every lesion a note in a symphony, every cough a phrase waiting to be heard. My charts grew stranger, filled with sketches rather than numbers, diagrams of patterns that reminded me of vines, of roots, of veins turned outward into soil. I knew the supervisors would call it madness if they saw, so I hid them, keeping the papers close, folding them into my coat. Still, I could not stop. My pen followed the whispers as much as my ears did. And the shapes that formed were not mine alone. They were given, flowing through me, guided by something vaster. The more I surrendered, the clearer it became. I was no longer only treating pain, I was translating it. Patients began to speak differently around me, their fear softening, their eyes less frantic, even as their bodies failed. They asked fewer questions about cures, more about meaning. Why does it hurt this way? What is the lesson here? And I found myself answering, not with prescriptions, but with interpretations. I told them their suffering was not emptiness, but speech, not punishment, but testimony. That each pang was a message from the body, a signal of change, an invitation to growth. I watched their faces ease, saw shoulders relax, breaths steady, as though meaning itself was medicine more powerful than any vial. The clinic became less a place of despair and more a place of strange reverence. The walls still stank of antiseptic, the machine still hummed, but beneath it all lay a new current, humming with the song I had first heard in Jeremiah's chamber. My colleagues avoided my gaze, muttering about fatigue, stress, corruption perhaps, but they did not interfere. They feared what they sensed but could not name. And I, caught between dread and awe, continued my work with hands that no longer felt entirely mine. They belonged partly to me and partly to the garden I had come to serve. Yet I began to notice something deeper. Their pain did not vanish, but their relationship to it transformed. It was as though every wound had become a teacher, every sickness a doorway, every shiver a prayer. I found myself whispering words I had never learned, half lullaby, half benediction, as I treated them. The patients smiled through cracked lips. Some wept, some laughed, and I knew then that I had crossed a line invisible, one that could never be uncrossed. And in that moment I felt a quiet certainty, a truth that pressed against my ribs like a seed waiting to sprout. This was not corruption at all, but communion, and I was no longer standing apart from it. I was part of the garden already, root and branch, healer and soil, patient and priest in one body. The purge never begins with fire. It begins with whispers. Rumors move faster than flames, seeping through corridors, winding down stairwells, carried in the breath of patients who return to their hab blocks with strange serenity. Reports multiplied of recoveries that were not recoveries at all. Men whose chronic pains no longer tormented them, though the damage remained. Women who smiled through infections as though illness had become blessing. Children who whispered songs in sleep that no one had taught them. The administratum noticed because the administratum always notices. Numbers were logged, trends were marked, anomalies underlined in red ink on forms that traveled upward through dusty chains of command. And whispers became questions. Dr. Matthias called me to his office, the lumen lights flickering against walls bare of decoration, the air thick with alcohol and rust. He looked at me not with accusation, but with unease, as though he no longer knew the man he had hired 6 years ago. Patients claim their pain no longer troubles them, he said, voice low, careful. Not because it is gone, but because they have learned to love it. Do you know what that sounds like? His hands trembled on the desk, fingers tapping out a rhythm neither of us wanted to name. I held his gaze, searching for anger, but finding only curiosity, a hunger edged with fear. I could have lied, could have claimed ignorance, could have folded myself back into the shape the Imperium demanded. But the truth pressed against my lips until it broke free. The body is not a machine to be repaired, I told him. It is a garden to be tended. And sometimes the most beautiful flowers grow from the darkest soil. The words left me with a weight and a relief, like confession before an altar, not of the Emperor, but of something older, something patient. For a moment, silence reigned, broken only by the distant rattle of pipes and the hum of failing vents. Then Matthias exhaled, slow and heavy, as though acknowledging he had heard more than doctrine allowed. The mini-climax hung between us. Not a shout, not a curse, but a recognition. He saw me as changed, and I saw that he had not reported me, yet. Fear flickered in his eyes, but so too did something else. Anticipation. The quiet dread of a man who knows the administratum's gaze is already turning our way. He leaned closer. There are reports, he whispered, from other districts. Physicians speaking as you do. Methods changing. Recoveries unexplained. His lips tightened. The administratum has begun to take interest. Suspense thickened the air. Outside, the clinic carried on as though nothing shifted, yet every cough, every moan of pain felt like a hymn to something forbidden. My hands itched to continue, to touch, to translate. But I also felt the shadow of scrutiny lengthening across the ward. They would come, not with torches first, but with clipboards, with questions, with eyes sharpened to slice truth from heresy. My heart raced not only with fear, but with strange anticipation. If they asked, would I hide? Could I? Or had I already surrendered too much of myself to the garden's growth to deny it? That night, as I made my rounds, every step felt watched. Every cough echoed too loudly. Patients smiled at me with a trust that was dangerous, that could betray us all. And in the hum of the vents, I thought I heard whispers not only of spores, but of the administratum itself, already listening, already writing its reports. The purge was coming. The shadows lengthened, and in those shadows, I saw not only fear, but promise. Because scrutiny meant acknowledgement, and acknowledgement meant the garden was no longer hidden. The seed had broken the soil. Fragile yet unstoppable, and whether they crushed it or not, its roots were already threading deep. And when I looked again at Matthias, I saw in his eyes the same conflict burning in mine. Fear of collapse, but also a terrible hope that perhaps collapse was only another word for growth. The air grew heavy then, filled with a silence so dense it felt alive, and in that silence I knew change had already begun. And then came the inspectors, cloaked in black. Their boots rang on the metal floors like judgment itself, slow, measured, deliberate. And with every step, the ward seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would bloom from fear. They called it an inspection, but their masks betrayed executioners. The clinic shook as the black uniformed redemptionists stormed in, boots clanging like iron hammers on metal floors, each step measured, merciless, echoing like judgment. Their masks were expressionless, lenses glowing faintly red, vox grills hissing with every breath, voices distorted into static that stripped them of humanity. They fanned through the ward with precision, clipboards in one hand, shock mauls in the other, a ledger of faith in one palm and punishment in the other. Patients recoiled, some whispering prayers, others too weak to resist. The smell of disinfectant clashed with the sharper stink of burning incense that trailed behind the enforcers, smoke curling in patterns like chains. They began their questioning. Name, origin, loyalty. Each patient forced to answer beneath the glare of lumen light, their words scribbled down like charges already prepared. Matthias stood before them, hands shaking but voice steady, proclaiming that we were faithful servants, that illness was only illness, that recovery was no heresy but blessing from the Emperor. His face was pale, his breath quick, but he denied nothing of doctrine, repeating catechisms like shields. For a moment it seemed he might succeed, that the tide of suspicion would ebb. But then their eyes turned to me. The leader of the band stepped closer, mask black as void, lenses reflecting my face distorted. His voice rasped like a blade dragged across stone. You. Reports say you teach that pain is joy, that sickness is gift, that flesh is garden. He leaned close, vox crackling. Do you deny? Silence spread, heavy, suffocating. Matthias gripped my arm, whispering, Say the words. Deny. Live. The patients stared, wide-eyed, holding their breath as if their fates hung on my tongue. The moment stretched, heartbeats pounding like drums in a funeral procession. And then I spoke. I deny nothing. The words cracked the air like thunder. Matthias staggered, patients gasped. The redemptionists tightened their grips on weapons. Yet before their shock could become violence, something in me loosened. Something I had held back too long. A sound rose from my throat, low at first, trembling like a hymn half forgotten. Then stronger, fuller, until it filled the ward. It was song, but not of the Emperor's litanies. It was the song Jeremiah had taught me, the song of rot and renewal, the melody of the garden. My chest burned as I sang. Each note carrying spores that shimmered faintly in the light, drifting like dust motes, unseen until they glowed green gold. They floated over the ward, settling on sheets, on wounds, on steel. And as they touched flesh, the transformation began. Lesions pulsed with warmth instead of pain. Eyes widened, then softened with strange joy. A dying man sat upright, breath smooth for the first time in years. A child stopped crying and laughed, high and clear, a sound more beautiful than any hymn. The enforcers faltered, raising weapons, but hesitating as spores clung to their armor, creeping into seams, glowing faintly like fireflies. The mini-climax was chaos turned revelation. Their orders were to purge, but their hearts stumbled as they witnessed not decay, but blooming. I sang louder, the spores answering, spreading, weaving a tapestry of living light across the clinic. Even Matthias, trembling, tears on his cheeks, whispered, Emperor, forgive us, as his trembling hand reached toward the glow. I had become both accused and prophet, both heretic and healer, and the ward had become not a prison, but a garden. The redemptionists shouted commands, their voices breaking, some striking out, others backing away, torn between fear and awe. Yet the truth had already taken root. Their shock bathed the room in hesitation, and hesitation is deadly. One swung his shock maul, but spores burst at the impact, coating him in a luminous haze that made his movements sluggish, his strikes uncertain. Another tore off his mask to scream, but in doing so inhaled, and his rage turned to convulsions, not of agony but of laughter, a deep, booming laugh that broke the order of their ranks. Patients began to rise, some still frail, some broken, yet all with eyes lit by the glow of communion. They moved not as a mob, but as a choir, each voice adding to mine, singing the same melody as though it had been waiting in their throats all along. The ward itself vibrated with sound, walls humming, pipes rattling like organs played by unseen hands. The enforcers were no longer in control. They were witnesses, caught in the tide. I could see their discipline unravel, their grips trembling on mauls and bolters, the weight of doctrine collapsing under the proof that suffering had become something radiant. Matthias sank to his knees, caught between worship and terror, his catechisms faltering into sobs. And in that moment, I knew the purge had failed before it began. What bloomed was not death, but awakening. And as the spores thickened, swirling like dust storms under lumen glow, I saw in their fearful faces the truth they dared not speak aloud. That faith itself had shifted, that the Emperor's silence was being answered by another song, and no purge could erase it. The flames did not kill them. They bloomed into gardens of flesh. The Redemptionists raised their plasma weapons with ritual precision, their black masks glowing faintly red in the lumen light, as their commander barked the order through a vox grill that turned words into metallic echoes. A moment later, the ward erupted in light, bolts of caged suns tearing through the recycled air, filling the room with a stench of ozone and scorched metal. I braced for screams, for the silence of ash, for the clean finality of sanctioned death. But instead of ending, life unfurled in shapes no doctrine could name. Mrs. Corv was the first to fall. For decades she had shuffled into the clinic with her hands swollen and twisted, each joint a knot of bone and agony, her body bent beneath invisible weight. The plasma bolt struck her directly, and for a heartbeat, I thought she had vanished. Then her body expanded outward, not as fire consuming, but as petals opening. Flesh spilled into vines that pulsed with rhythm, curling across her bed and along the cracked tiles, sprouting buds that glowed softly green. Her knotted hands blossomed into flowering clusters, each finger replaced by tendrils that swayed like grass in a sacred breeze. I felt her presence in the growth, nurturing, patient, almost maternal. Her consciousness woven into the vines that spread across the ward. She was not gone. She had multiplied, transformed into a garden that breathed with her memory. Thomas Herrick was next. The plasma burned through his chest, and his scarred lungs ignited. But instead of collapsing into ruin, they burst into fireworks of spores. Each gasp became a shower of golden dust, each ragged breath scattering seeds that shimmered in the dim light. They drifted over bed frames, clung to uniforms, seeped into ventilation ducts, carried on every current of recycled air. They settled on Redemptionist armor, glowing faintly, alive and insistent. The smell was not decay, but fertile soil after rain, rich, inviting, impossible to ignore. His death was not silence. It was expansion. The air itself thickened with promise. And then Sarah Chen smiled as the fire reached her. Her skin had long been marked with dry scales that cracked under strain, but now they peeled back like petals, each patch unfolding into delicate blossoms. The plasma should have destroyed her, yet instead she dissolved into a cloud of shimmering pollen, her face blooming in joy as her body scattered into golden motes. The pollen rose, carried by vents and ducts, spreading her essence beyond the ward, into the lungs of thousands who would never know her name. Her laughter lingered in the haze, a chorus of joy drifting through every breath. Death had been rewritten before their eyes. Where the Redemptionists expected cleansing silence, they found gardens where bodies once lay, music where coughs had lingered, laughter where pain should have screamed. Their discipline faltered, weapons shaking, formations breaking. One cried, "Abomination!" But the word cracked in his throat, empty of conviction. Another whispered, almost too softly to hear, "It feels peaceful," as spores clung to his gauntlet, pulsing like a heartbeat. The ward itself seemed to breathe. Lumen strips flickered and died, but Corv's glowing vines filled the room with a verdant light. The spores from Herrick drifted in golden shafts, each mote dancing in rhythm with the song that still trembled from my throat. Chen's pollen turned the air into sacred haze, transforming every inhale into communion, every exhale into hymn. Even the walls shivered as if awakening, rust flaking into patterns that resembled leaves. I watched the redemptionists recoil, masks hiding faces twisted in terror and doubt, their training shattered by the revelation before them. Some tried to reload, fingers clumsy, shaking as spores already worked their way into cracks of armor and filters. One fell to his knees coughing, his vox breaking into static as he gagged, then laughed, a strange laugh that frightened even his brothers. They had come to burn, to purge, to erase corruption with sanctioned fire. But the fire they trusted had betrayed them, for it had not destroyed, it had fertilized. Their weapons had not cleansed, they had consecrated. In their zeal, they had become gardeners without knowing. The plasma they wielded had not killed my patience. It had completed their transformation. I felt the truth resonating in my lungs, in the spores clinging to my skin, in the vines that pulsed beneath my feet. I raised my voice above the chaos, letting the harmonics deepen, letting the garden sing through me. "This is not ruin," I declared, my words ringing with resonance that shook the ward. "This is evolution." The redemptionists stumbled back, shaken, confused, their certainties collapsing like brittle glass. They clutched their weapons tighter, as if steel and plasma could shield them from what they had already breathed, what had already entered their veins. But I saw in their hesitation, in their trembling grips and darting eyes, that their faith had cracked. The purge had failed. The Emperor's fire had not delivered purity. It had revealed possibility. They called it ruin, but I saw only evolution. From the deepest tunnels, I learned the truth. The Hive itself was alive. We slipped through maintenance shafts and forgotten corridors, fleeing the redemptionists' failed purge, until stone gave way to foundations older than any record. These were not the levels of Tertius Magna listed in Administratum schematics. These were the bones beneath, carved by civilizations long dead, where murals of death and rebirth lingered like half-remembered dreams. There, among the ruins of a temple swallowed by industry, we gathered. Survivors transformed, the touched and the willing. Factory workers scarred by acid. Sump rats who had breathed poisoned air so long their lungs welcomed spores. Even our bites stripped of armor and oath, broken by the cruelty they once served. We were many, but not yet whole. We coughed, we laughed, we sang in fragments, the beginnings of a chorus not yet unified. It was then that Cyrus, once a tech adept, rose among us. His skull bristled with implants, no longer steel but flowering metal, cables sprouting like roots, lenses glowing with phosphorescent sheen. His voice came fractured, layered, harmonics of machine code and hymn, but every word cut clear. "The Hive spirit knows us," he said. "It has always known us." He spoke of machine spirit doctrine, how the Mechanicus had reduced it to ritual, worship of switches and oil. But beneath their ignorance, the truth waited. The Hive systems, ventilation, waste, power, were not mere constructs. Over centuries, over millennia, they had grown, fused, adapted. Every upgrade, every patch, every new circuit had been added to something already awake. "It has been waiting," Cyrus whispered, his metal tongue clanging against organic harmonics. "And it has chosen." Doubt flickered among us. Could ducts and wires, engines and fans truly watch us? But then the air changed. A low vibration hummed through the stone, through the rusted pipes, through our very bones. The lumen strips flickered, not in failure, but in rhythm, pulsing like veins. The walls themselves seemed to inhale, drawing spores inward and exhaling them outward with deliberate care. I felt it then, the hive's breath aligning with ours. Cyrus placed his hand against the wall, and where steel should have been cold, it was warm, pliant, beating faintly as if with blood. We followed. One by one we laid our hands upon it, and in that touch communion sparked. Memories surged, not just ours, but echoes of centuries, riots crushed in fire, plagues starved into silence, generations born and buried in the same stone. The hive remembered. It had been prison, factory, tomb. Now it would become garden. The spores we carried, the changes we bore, were not infection, but completion. The hive did not resist them. It embraced them. Air recyclers shifted pitch, carrying spores across districts. Water treatment plants thickened with nutrients no human design had ever included. Machine code wove itself into organic patterns, logic merging with instinct, steel and spore moving as one. It was not corruption, it was synthesis. The mini-climax struck as vents above us shuddered open, releasing warm drafts scented with earth, with rot, with sweetness. The hive was breathing, not as a machine, but as a body. Corroded girders sprouted moss of steel and sinew. The murals on the walls pulsed as though veins ran beneath pigment, and data conduits flickered not with binary, but with patterns resembling spores under a microscope. Cyrus smiled, and the glow of his lenses reflected our awe. "Do you see? We were not outcasts. We were seeds. And this hive is our soil." I felt it then. No longer just individuals, no longer alone in our transformations. The hive itself welcomed us. A vast womb willing to carry the garden of the grandfather. We were not many scattered heretics. We were the beginnings of an organism, human, machine, and decay, bound together. The resolution came gently, inevitably. Where once the hive had been prison, it was now seed pod. Where once ducts carried only recycled air, now they spread spores with devotion, each fan a bellows of faith. Where once data streams carried quotas and decrees, now they sang in patterns of growth and bloom. In us, in the walls, in the breath of every unseen corridor, Nurgle's gift had taken root, and it would not be contained. For the redemptionists searched the levels above with flamers and decrees, burning flesh, purging rooms, yet they could not touch what had already merged into the hive's veins. Their fire could only carve wounds, and wounds only grew scabs, and scabs only became new tissue. They thought we were hiding, but the truth was different. We were germinating. From a single cough came a song that now echoes through the galaxy. In the depths of Tertius Magna, the hive had shed its disguise of steel and stone, and I walked its corridors not as prison, but as garden. The walls pulsed like veins, the lumen strips glowed with bioluminescence. The vents sighed with spores, as though the very air had learned to breathe. Rust no longer flaked into nothing. It flowered into moss of metal flesh, curling tendrils that glimmered with dew. Floors once worn by factory boots now hummed beneath our steps, alive with roots that ran deeper than any pipeline. We were surrounded not by decay, but by growth that sang with every heartbeat, a harmony of rot and renewal. It was in this place that Dr. Matthias completed his transformation. Once he had been a physician, bound by protocol, a servant of doctrine. But as the Hive awakened, he surrendered himself fully. His body no longer resembled the man I had once known. His chest divided into chambers that beat in symphony. His lungs drank gases beyond oxygen. His voice came not from a single mouth, but from every surface he touched. "I see them," he whispered, harmonics vibrating the very pipes. "They are not gone. They are everywhere." And I felt it too. The collective. The chorus of minds once isolated in pain, now distributed like seeds across the Hive. Mrs. Corv's gentle presence pulsed through vines that wrapped the clinic ruins. Thomas Herrick's music echoed in the ducts, with each push of recycled air. Sarah Chen's laughter drifted in golden pollen, touching lips and tongues across levels. They were not dead. They had become network, memory, communion. And through Matthias, I glimpsed the greater revelation. The spores had already traveled further. Ships had left the Hive before the purge, carrying cargo, food, workers. Within their holds, invisible moats clung to clothes and breath. Hidden passengers crossing the void. Other worlds had already inhaled the first notes of the song. At first, the thought shook me. How small we were, how fragile. But the garden was patient. The grandfather was patient. No wall of quarantine, no decree of purity, no flamer or orbital strike could halt what had already been exhaled. The mini-climax was the vision that flooded me as the Hive circuits opened like roots across the stars. I felt lungs breathe in distant manufactorums, tasted spores in the air of far-off habs, heard coughs that began as weakness but would end as music. Worlds that had never known our names would soon dream of gardens where corpses bore fruit, where tumors whispered truth, where death became door rather than ending. Humanity, in its rigidity, called it corruption. But I saw it clearly. It was metamorphosis, inevitable and kind. The resolution came not as thunder, but as acceptance. We no longer feared death, for death was only another verse. We no longer clung to the illusion of purity, for purity was sterility, and sterility was the only true void. In embracing rot, we had found renewal. In accepting weakness, we had discovered strength. The Hive was no longer alone. It was seed pod. And every cough, every dream, every surrender of flesh would carry the song forward. I felt the galaxy tremble, not with fear but with anticipation, as if every dying breath across 1,000,000 worlds now bent toward chorus. From a single cough had come a harmony that no creed could silence, no bolt gun could kill, no pyre could cleanse. The grandfather's patience had been rewarded. His garden would never end.